Okay, so yeah, good morning everyone. Thank you for joining this Heat Networks and Consumer Protection webinar. I'm Christina from GemServe and we're the delivery partner for the Heat Networks Efficiency Scheme and hosting this session today. So just some housekeeping to run through first of all. As Sam said, the session will be recorded today. Please mute your microphones if you're not speaking just to avoid disruption. And please turn off your webcams as well just to improve the video quality. We will be taking questions today, so please pop them in the chat and we'll make sure we can address them if we can. And then looking at the agenda, we'll kick off with my colleague Sam, and she'll be giving a bit of an introduction to Heat Networks and the opportunity. We're delighted to have Stephen Knight from Heat Trust with us today. He'll be talking about customer experience of Heat Networks. And then handing over to my colleague Louise Singleton, who'll be looking at the Heat Networks Efficiency Scheme specifically. And then we're also delighted to have Chloe and Isabel from the Guinness Partnership, and they'll be given a bit of a case study of their experience as a successful HNES applicant. And I'll just hand straight over to Sam.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Samantha Shea. I'm the Head of Policy Insight and Engagement at GemServe, and I support on the communications for the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. So we all know that heat networks will play a really key role in delivering UK's net zero targets. And the Climate Change Committee has proposed that by 2050, around 20% of UK heat will be delivered by heat networks. But as you can see on screen today, only about 3% of heat is delivered in this way. Significant potential for growth across the market in the UK in particular. The graphic here on screen is from one of the department's recent publications view of the heat network market. So there's a really big opportunity for us to scale up and hit those targets. So to do that, we need to accelerate growth at a really rapid rate. The graph on screen, again taken from the same document, shows that a BAU scenario, a steady growth scenario, really isn't going to be enough to hit that 20% target. And whilst we know that to hit the target, we'll need to construct many more new heat networks and expand existing ones, it's also important that we don't forget the 14,000 or so district and communal heat networks that already exist in the UK and are already supplying heating and hot water to around 500,000, just under 500,000 homes across the UK. As you'll hear today, many of these heat networks don't perform as we'd expect. And this means that consumers are facing higher bills as a result, and inefficient heat networks make it harder for us to achieve our climate change targets. So we really do need to focus on ensuring the networks that exist and the ones that we're building and will supply heat to homes and businesses across the country in the future are as efficient as possible and are able to adopt low carbon technologies whilst delivering a really great experience for consumers. So what's the government doing to develop the market? We've seen a range of policies introduced from 2013. There's been support available to help fund feasibility work and enable detailed project design through the Heat Network Delivery Unit, and that's still available today. We saw the Heat Networks Investment Project support the construction of many heat networks across England and Wales. And that was replaced by the Green Heat Network Fund quite recently. And then earlier this year, the government opened the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, which my colleague Louise will talk to you a bit more about and hopefully give you an opportunity to ask questions about the scheme itself. There is also a piece of work being undertaken to develop heat network technical assurance scheme to help ensure that networks are meeting those minimum standards that we'd expect to see to ensure that consumers are having a good experience on the networks. And the government's also undertaking a lot of work at the moment to build out a market framework and heat network zoning. And a key part of that market framework is consumer protection. It's it's really important that as people working in this industry, people with an interest in heat networks, that you have your say when the government is looking to develop their proposals. And the government's currently seeking input into the decisions around the future regulation of the market, specifically in relation to consumer protection. So there's currently a joint consultation being held by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and Ofgem, and it closes on the 27th of October. We'd strongly recommend that you review the proposals within this consultation document. And even if you're supportive of the proposals, it's really useful for you to respond to that consultation to ensure that your response is heard and the proposals go ahead as proposed. And if you disagree with any of the recommendations or the proposals that are outlined in the consultation, then make sure that your concerns are raised, as it will help shape the future legislative framework in the UK. I've also included an image here of the Building a Market Framework consultation, which closed fairly recently. It gives a really good overview of what the government's looking to do to build out the regulatory framework. It's worth taking a look at that, and I can put the link in the chat. So I'm going to hand over now to Stephen Knight from the Heat Trust to talk about some of the insights that they have from running a voluntary consumer protection scheme and his thoughts on the future of the market. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, and welcome everyone to this webinar this morning. So I first of all want to start off by a little bit of introduction in terms of Heat Trust. Heat Trust is the independent national consumer protection scheme for heat networks and for the sector. We act essentially as a consumer champion for heat networks. And the scheme which we run, which was launched in 2015, initially by a combination of industry and government working together to establish a consumer protection scheme, was initially, and to some extent still today, largely energy supply company type heat network operators tended to register with our scheme, and so we still have a majority of the heat networks registered with us are run by energy supply companies. So these are companies that have taken over running heat networks on behalf of landlords on long-term concession arrangements, typically. That said, we've had more and more heat networks join us in recent years, our scheme, and we've got a number now of local authority heat suppliers, of housing association, and indeed private landlord heat suppliers that are registered with the scheme as well. And the aim of our scheme was really to provide heat network customers with similar sorts of consumer protections that customers in the gas and electric sector would have, and therefore we have scheme rules which are based around the license conditions in gas and electric sector. And we provide access to the Energy Ombudsman for customers for independent dispute resolution, and so on. And we monitor and audit those heat suppliers that are registered with our scheme. Now, that's all very well and good, but there are some things our scheme doesn't cover. We don't regulate prices. We're a voluntary scheme, and we don't regulate technical standards either, beyond some relatively limited measures. So there are some gaps in our scheme, but more fundamentally, it's a voluntary scheme, and therefore only about 1 in 10 heat network customers nationally are covered by it. So we have set some industry standards on consumer protection, and we do protect a good number of heat network customers, but there's still the majority out there that aren't protected, and that's why I think regulations are coming, and certainly we strongly welcome mandatory regulation across the sector. So what is the consumer experience of heat networks? And I suppose I wanted to start off by giving a flavour of some of the issues that heat network customers in particular have felt during the energy crisis of the last couple of years. Now, we all know that energy bills have gone up because of sky-high commercial energy costs and wholesale energy costs. And of course, heat networks are not protected by the domestic price cap, because heat network operators are considered commercial purchasers of energy, and therefore they have to purchase energy alongside other businesses and on the commercial markets, which are not price regulated. In fact, not very have very little levels of regulation at all. And therefore, they've seen very, very big increases over the last couple of years. They've seen very volatile prices, and typically heat network operators have to buy their gas on a fixed price, fixed term basis. And if the heat prices or the wholesale prices are particularly high at the point they have to renew their contracts, then they can often be stuck with very high priced energy for 12 months. And so we have seen some heat suppliers paying anything up to 20 pence or more for gas over the last couple of years. In particular, during 2022 was the worst of it. We've also seen, because of the way that government subsidies have been targeted at domestic customers, often these customers have missed out on the most generous government subsidies during the energy crisis. So, for instance, the subsidies for business consumers far less generous than subsidies for domestic consumers, and therefore it's often taking government a little bit of extra time to find a way of getting subsidies to people on heat networks. And the other big issue that has driven poor experiences and high cost is poor efficiency. And pre-crisis levels, or pre-crisis, I should say, many heat network operators could access really cheap gas, and therefore inefficiencies in the system really, were not too obvious to customers, because the gas was so cheap that it didn't matter too much if most of it went up in the air. But we do see efficiencies of 30 to 40% on many heat networks. Some of them much better, but that's not untypical to see 30 to 40% efficiency levels, and that means really expensive heat coming out of that combination of this really high gas prices and poorly efficient systems. And we have seen customers facing heat prices, not everybody, but in some cases, up to 50 pence per kilowatt hour. And I have heard of examples of more than that, even quite recently. And that's set against a domestic customer who, at the height of the energy crisis last winter, was paying about 12 pence per kilowatt hour for heat, once you've taken into account the typical efficiency of a gas boiler. So really expensive, really volatile, and those who are on unmetered systems, 50, 60, in some cases nearly £70 a week for heating and hot water. So this is a really big issue. Not everybody, but many customers have faced really almost unaffordable prices as a result of a combination of factors. But what I want to focus on today is the contribution of inefficiency to all of this, because obviously that's the subject of the heat network efficiency scheme, and that's an important way that we can control costs on heat networks. And here I've got a couple of charts which I hope can kind of graphically illustrate the point of why efficiency really matters and affects price for customers. So on the left-hand side of this, you're seeing what is almost an ideal situation for heat network. 65% efficiency is probably as good as they get. Now, what we've got here is the red wedge is the amount of energy which goes up the flue from the boiler. Now, I've put 16% in here, but it might be less than that in the case of a really good boiler system. But the reason I've got 16% here is it's actually the figure that is considered typical for a domestic boiler. Now, a lot of big communal boilers could do better than that, so it may not be representative of communal boilers, but nevertheless, it's a kind of constant in this, because no matter how efficient your heat network is, there will be some heat lost up the flue. But the important bit here is the heat loss from the heat network pipes, which is the purple aspect. And in a really good system, that might be 20% or so of the heat that's generated. The heat energy within the gas is lost within the pipes, transmitting it from the boiler to the individual home. However, more typically, we see around half of the heat being lost in the pipes. And the chart on the right-hand side, sadly, is not untypical of many heat networks that we see. And what that means in real terms is that I've got some figures at the bottom here which assume that the gas is delivered at a certain price, and the price I put in here is not, it's 7.83 pence. It's not a completely random figure. It's actually the figure that the current government subsidy scheme for heat networks, which is the energy bill discount scheme for heat networks, sets as a ceiling. So all heat networks should, in theory, be able to access gas at this price at the moment. If you translate gas at that cost, after all these inefficiencies, on the left-hand side, for a good system, you get heat at 12 pence a kilowatt hour. On the right-hand side, you have to pay 22 pence per kilowatt hour. So you can see a rough idea that poor inefficiency, poor heat losses in the system make a huge difference. And it's not just to the price, it's also to the amount of gas you're burning. On the left-hand side, you're burning perhaps 30% more gas than a domestic boiler would be to generate the same amount of heat, and that's because you've always got some heat losses. On the right-hand side, 140% more gas, 140% more CO2 than you would with a standalone domestic boiler. Even the 12 pence per kilowatt hour is significantly more than you'd be paying if you're on the current price cap level of domestic gas, which is currently 6.9 pence per kilowatt hour for gas, and that translates into a heat cost of about 8 pence. So as you can see, even with an efficient system, you're going to struggle to deliver heat at the same price as a domestic boiler right now. But if you've got a really inefficient system like the one on the right, which I say is not untypical, you're going to be a lot more expensive. And so just to go back to that slide again, that's it. There are two main sources of difference between the chart on the left and the chart on the right, or two main things that lead to the level of heat loss in pipes. And those two things are the temperature of those pipes, and that's the flow and return temperatures. The higher the temperature of a body, the more radiation it emits. It's basic thermodynamics physics, and therefore the lower you can get your flow and return temperatures around a heat network, the less heat loss you're going to have. So too high a temperature is a big cause of heat losses. And the other thing is insulation of those pipes. And if those pipes are not really well insulated, particularly given how hot they are all year round, then you're going to lose a lot of heat. And it's really important, I think, to understand heat network pipes are typically hot 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And that means that you're going to be pumping a lot of heat into those pipes if they're leaking, even in the middle of summer, and that's wasted energy that's costing consumers quite a lot of money. So next slide. So I've talked a bit about efficiency and why that matters and how that affects heat price, but another real area of consumer detriment that we see on heat networks is around reliability. As I said earlier, we monitor all of the heat networks that are registered with our scheme, and one of the monitoring bits of information we ask for is all the reports of supply outages that consumers experience throughout the year. They have to be reported to us. We monitor them and analyze them. And the chart I put up here attempts to demonstrate the sort of numbers of interruptions which customers experience, the average customer experience across those schemes that are registered with Heat Trust on an annual basis. And you can see over the course of the last few years, typically customers experience about 5 interruptions a year. They're about 5.5 hours long on average, and there's big variation in all of this. And typically perhaps one of those interruptions is due to planned maintenance, and the other 4 are due to unplanned interruptions. Now, I don't know about the other people on this call, but I mean, I'm not on a heat network. I have my own gas boiler, but I don't experience 4 or 5 interruptions to my heating and hot water every year on average. That simply is not the case. Typically, domestic gas boilers aren't that unreliable, and certainly gas supplies aren't that unreliable. So I think this is clearly an area where heat networks need to do better. And I would say that I I think there's some strong evidence to suggest that those heat networks that are registered with Heat Trust are probably performing significantly better on this than the rest of the sector. And that's partly because if you're registered with Heat Trust, then you commit to paying your customers compensation for longer interruptions. So there's a real incentive to reduce interruptions and to keep those interruptions short. So I have a fear that actually the situation out there in the rest of the heat network sector could be significantly worse than this. So I think reliability is a big issue. And if we look at the causes of unreliability on heat networks, because we also ask our suppliers what was the main cause of the interruptions which you're reporting to us, you can see a big chunk, and this has been consistent over a few years now, are faults to do with pumps and pressurization units within the network. And one could well imagine that a lot of pump failures are due to poorly optimized networks, pumps having to work too hard, water quality issues, and a whole range of other issues to do with poorly performing heat networks. One thing I would draw your attention to is the proportion of interruptions due to in-property issues. That's things like heat interface units within flats, heat meters, is relatively small. We're talking 4 or 5% typically of the overall interruption experience. So most of the problems are to do with the wider heat network going down due to pumps and pressurization units. And that's because they typically affect far more customers than individual in-property issues. So I wanted to sort of finally say that, thank you. If you move on to the last slide, that's the one. I finally wanted to say, of course, as was mentioned earlier, that the government is moving to introduce, as you know, regulation of the heat network sector. Parliament is due to consider the final stages, I think, of the energy bill next week when it returns to the party conference season, and I imagine that that's likely to be wrapped up within a couple of weeks. Now, this bill introduces will introduce mandatory technical standards for heat networks, and that will include meeting minimum levels of performance in terms of things like efficiency and reliability. Regulations due to come in 2025, as said. For legacy heat networks, there will probably be a period of some years over which they have to get the standards of performance up to a good level, and that could be some number of years, and consultation on that will happen. But I want to leave you with one thought, and that is that government policy generally is not to grant fund things which people have to do by law. So if you want to get your performance up to standard, I suggest everybody should be making use of grant funding that's available now, because the reality is you probably will have to do this in a few years' time, and there may not be grant funding available then. So I think the message I really want to leave you with is, for consumers, heat network performance is critical to consumer outcomes. And it's really important if you're running a heat network that this is something that you look to address. And if you don't address it, regulation is coming, and the HNES type schemes might not be available then. So I think hopefully that's given you an overview of the consumer experience. And I've put my email address there. Very happy to get emails from anyone who'd like to explore these issues further, and anyone who's got any questions now.
Thanks, Stephen. We have had a couple of questions come through. So the first one is around the 49% heat loss that you mentioned from pipes. Are those principally pipes buried in the ground, or pipes in the building that sort of distribution network to individual units?
Yeah, so I'm probably not the best person to answer this, because we're not, I think there are others who will be more aware of the technical things, technical side of this. But from what I understand, most of the worst heat losses are typically the pipes within buildings, and you often see pipes that aren't too long pipe runs, for instance, and not properly insulated pipes. That said, the overall temperature of the flow within those pipes, of course, is also critical. And that applies to the pipes in the ground as well as the pipes in the building. And so that's really important. And that's controlled, I guess, from the energy centre, and it's something that can be adjusted from there.
Great, thank you. Another question, is there a trend in the efficiency of networks based on the year of installation? Sort of older networks versus newer networks?
This is an interesting. I mean, I don't have a huge amount of evidence on this, I have to say, and I don't think anybody does. I mean, it may be that through things like the HNES demonstrator program and predecessor programs that governments run, there might be some evidence, but I've not seen it. One might imagine that a lot of really old networks are going to be super inefficient, and that may well be the case. And certainly they're likely to be less well insulated pipes and so on. One of the issues, of course, is the really old networks probably are not metered, and therefore the data to demonstrate their efficiency may not be there. But what I would say is the assumption that new heat networks are likely to be much better is not always borne out by what I've seen. And I've certainly seen a number of cases of heat networks that have been built in the last 5-10 years, which are really poorly performing in terms of efficiency. So whilst there may be a trend, I wouldn't say that there's much evidence that newer heat networks are really very much better, sadly. I mean, clearly, if they've been built to really high technical standards, they should be much, much better. And there are examples of those that have performed at the really high end levels performance. Certainly they're out there, but sadly not all of them. And there are, as I say, examples of quite modern heat networks that are still performing at really low efficiency levels.
I can just come in on that one, Sam, as well, on what we've seen through HNES. I agree, we have got some networks coming through that were built in the 70s, like you say, underground pipe work that just they didn't have the same level of standards of insulation as we would do today. But it's not always just those kind of older networks that we're seeing coming through as well. We are seeing more recent networks applying as well.
Great, thank you both. There's a few more comments in the chat, but I think if we move on to the next presentation, and then we'll come back to the questions at the end.
Fab. Okay, I think that's me then. Hi everyone. So I'm Louise Singleton. I'm leading the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme for GemServe. So the scheme launched back in February. There's a team of us delivering the scheme. So GemServe has overall responsibility for the scheme delivery, and we're working with Ramboll, who are our technical partners. We worked together on the demonstrator, which ran back in 2022. And we're working again together on the main scheme, and we've also got Turner and Townsend involved, who are providing pre-application supports, so a relationship manager service for people that are looking to apply and maybe want some support with completing their applications. And then we have LuxNova, who are providing legal advice, particularly around things like grant funding agreements when we get to that stage. So a quick overview of what the what HNES is looking to achieve. So we have three main objectives. The first one is to reduce carbon emissions by making heat networks more efficient. But the second one, I guess, is really key within the scheme itself, and also obviously in the context of this seminar, which is reducing customer detriment to improve consumer confidence. Now, since we've gone from the demonstrator to the main scheme, this objective has kind of risen in prominence as well, particularly because of things that we're seeing through the energy crisis. Like I say, the demonstrator ran in sort of 21, 22. Since then, we've had things like the war in Ukraine that's really pushed up the price of energy. So this really has come to the fore in the main scheme. And the third objective is to help prepare the market for regulation and technical standards. So as Stephen said, the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme is being developed. There will be technical standards in place, and we're keen to help existing heat networks to improve their performance and their efficiency before those standards come into force. So in terms of funding that's available, we have two funding pots, which we call revenue grants and capital grants. So revenue grants are essentially for people that know that they've got a poorly performing heat network, but they don't know why, and they don't know what action they need to take to improve it. So it's fully funded, and it's basically to procure a third-party organisation to come in and carry out an optimization study. They will come on site, they will have a look at your existing data, if you have any. They will do an assessment of how your heat network is performing currently, and then they will make recommendations as to which measures would be suitable to improve the efficiency. There's the types of efficiency gains you could expect to make through those measures, and the costs of those measures as well, and sort of how much they'll pay back over what period of time. With the idea that at the end of this, you'll have a full report and a sort of techno-economic analysis of the recommendations that you can then use as a business case to look at implementing the capital works that are recommended. In terms of the pot for that, we have up to £2 million across this financial year and next financial year. It's worth saying that actually the funding for revenue for this financial year has now all been allocated in our previous funding rounds. So we're now looking just at the next financial year, which starts in April. And then on the capital side of things, this is to actually help people install the measures that they know they need to make. This is part funded, so the government will provide up to 50% of the project costs, and the applicant is then required to provide the rest. And yeah, it's looking at understanding what measures are being proposed, the evidence that you have as to why those are the correct measures, and the benefits that you will achieve from installing those. And funding for capital grants is up to 30 million across this financial year and next financial year. You can request funding across both financial years, but any funding that is awarded in a particular financial year must be spent within that financial year. There's no option to kind of roll it over if you don't spend it in time. But it's worth noting that the match funding doesn't have to be spent at the same time as your grant funding. So if you did want to apply for our next funding round for a capital grant, it would be possible to claim your grant funding in this financial year before the end of March, and then spend your match funding in the next financial year if you wanted to. So that is a possible thing to do. So in terms of who's eligible to apply, the applicant must be an operator of an existing district heating or communal heating system. So we're looking at improving the efficiency of existing heat networks, not helping to build new ones. The heat networks can be situated in England or Wales. And the organisations, it's open to public sector, private sector, third sector, NHS, universities, charities, anyone really that's got a heat network that they operate. And the person that applies must be able to sign off on investment decisions for the heat network. So for example, if you're looking at a revenue study, it won't be the consultant who applies, it will be the heat network operator who applies. The funding will be given to the heat network operator, who can then pay the consultant. We need to make sure that the people who are applying are the people that own the heat network and have the authority to sign off on these decisions. In terms of funding rounds, so we're halfway through our funding rounds. We've already completed rounds 1 to 4, or in the process of round 4. And our next funding round is round 5, and that closes on the 10th of November. If you are interested in applying, we'll be running an application webinar in a couple of weeks before the closing date. And I think there'll be links in the chat to our guidance document, and we've got contact details at the end for anyone that has any questions or wants to request an application form. But then our following rounds are in the next calendar year now. So round 6 is in February, round 7 in March, and round 8 in May. You may or may not have seen that we have recently announced the projects that were awarded funding in round 1. So I've got a link here to our press release, mainly because it goes into a bit more, it provides a sort of a sentence or two about the projects that have been awarded funding and what they're looking at doing, particularly for the capital projects. But just some of the examples of what the projects are looking to do. So we've got things like upgrading pipework, improving insulation was a big one, looking at controls, so heating controls, BMS systems, and improving those, replacing HIUs within dwellings, and looking at things like improving water quality and reducing leaks. So quite sort of a range of different measures that people are taking. Some of them are quite big undertakings, I guess, and yeah, they're all obviously designed to really improve the efficiency of the networks and the experience that the customers have on those networks. So I think I've got one more slide just to say about how you can get hold of us. So that's our email address, and like I say, we've got our relationship managers from Turner and Townsend who can help with any applications that you might want to submit. It's also worth noting that there is a heat network optimization guide that's been written by Fairheat and Anthesis, and there are 8 optimization videos that have been produced that look at different aspects of the heat networks and how you can make changes to improve their efficiency. So there's a link on that slide, but we can also drop that into the chat as well. So it's worth having a look at those if you are not quite sure where to start with improving your efficiency of your heat network. So I'm now going to hand over to Chloe and Isabel from the Guinness Partnership. They are one of our successful HNES projects, and they're going to talk through their experience and their heat network.
Hello. I'm Isabel McGuinness, Head of Contract Management at Guinness, and I'm joined by Chloe Jenner, who is our Communal Heat Network Manager. So we're here to talk to you today about a successful project that we've delivered with HNES funding. So the Guinness Partnership is a social landlord, and we have over 64,000 homes. In 2021, we secured funding through HNES to deliver a project in Crewe to undertake a retrofit programme, and we delivered this with the help of Fairheat. The site was called Waverley Court, which was a 13-storey residential building with 94 dwellings. And at 50 years old, the site was very typical of other buildings that we have as a housing association, and provides a really good case study of other social housing providers and how they can look to decarbonise their portfolio. So I'll now hand over to Chloe, who was heavily involved in the project, and she will take you through sort of what we did and some of the lessons that we learnt.
Thank you. So some of the problems that we were experiencing at Waverley Court before we applied was overheating, and this was both in dwellings and communal corridors. It was creating a high level of customer complaints and also scrutiny around customer comfort from external organisations. As an organisation, we were experiencing high energy costs. Customers pay via service charge, and there was no incentive for customers to be conservative in their usage. There was also poor reliability. We were getting at one point about 9 queries a month surrounding the heating system itself. They were a mixture of complaints, physical repairs, and also questions about when we were going to be carrying out upgrades, which linked to then high maintenance costs for the Guinness Partnership as well, which were increasing annually due to the poor reliability and call-outs for overheating concerns. And there was also a lack of resident control inside their homes. So they were all interconnected problems. And we applied for HNES funding so that we could start to tackle them. So this was part of the demonstrator. One of the things that I wanted to touch on was our customer engagement. I feel like a lot of the time on these webinars, it goes, you know, funding, projects, neat bow, but actually customer engagement and the customer journey and experience is a huge part of it, especially it feels like, you know, in social housing. So we tried lots of different approaches for customer engagement. We had a resident liaison officer on site 5 days a week, and a member of the communal heating team that was also on site once a week. We held open days for customers to build rapport with them and for customers to ask us questions directly about the new system. We are due to complete customer satisfaction surveys November this year. Work fully completed March 23, and we wanted to just give customers about 6 months and the opportunity to use their system in colder weather before we carried out any surveys. And we had an approach of calls, letters, text messages, emails, and also face-to-face. We wanted to make sure that we were both accessible and also accommodating of customers' work and school schedules, but still making sure they were aware of all the key updates. And finally, the support of our customer liaison officer for the area was crucial. Carrying out work inside customers' homes. Our contractors uncovered lots of issues that customers were facing, and this is all against a very challenging economic backdrop of September 22 to sort of Feb 23. So safeguarding the customers and also having that insight was really useful as well. So we did learn some lessons along the way. The greatest challenge on residential retrofit projects is always dwelling access. A large amount of time and resources were taken trying to access properties, and some customers just wouldn't engage with our team at all. Many appointments were cancelled last minute, and a small number of dwellings caused long project delays. Another thing that we continued to develop as the project went on was our customer communication. It was just really important that we adapted our approach and also learned, you know, and understood our customers more, and how we could convey messages better. Asbestos removal was quite tricky. As Isabel mentioned, it's a 1970s building, so it was riddled with asbestos. And we were aware of it, and we did carry out surveys, but the extent and the specialist intervention that was required was discovered along the way, and that at some points did slow down progress. And then lastly, just overall, my team weren't fully resourced and prepared enough for the work. We'd had carried out, you know, boiler room upgrades and similar works, but not to this extent and not for such a large building. We also carry out other work amongst our project work, gas compliance, renewable projects, and other urgent non-planned work. Single points of failure on our team also meant that any of our future works, we've now implemented a buddy system. So if someone does decide to leave the organisation, we're not losing all of the knowledge to do with that project. I'll pass back over to Isabel.
So in terms of looking forwards, we have secured some more funding through HNES for an upgrade of our HIUs at Bearbrook Place. So the lessons that we've learned along the way with Waverley Court, we will take forward and implement through Bearbrook, particularly in terms of customer communications. And although the work isn't due to start until early next year, we will be communicating with customers sort of towards, you know, in the next few months. So we give them a good heads up in terms of what we're going to do with the project and how that's going to impact them. And as Chloe said, we have learned a lot of lessons that we can take forwards.
Yes.
We'd now like to open up to any questions. Anybody has anything?
Feel free to raise your hand as well, if typing a question out is a little bit more time consuming. No. Whilst people are thinking about questions for Guinness, I've got a couple of questions for you, Louise, on HNES specifically. So the first one is, how does HNES ensure that the money is spent correctly and that it's not wasted?
So for all successful projects that receive HNES funding, there is a requirement to complete monitoring and reporting returns on a monthly basis. For revenue studies, that's up until the project is completed and you've received your optimization study. For capital projects, it's for 2 years after the project is commissioned. So things that we're tracking through our M&R returns are whether your project is running on track to against the timeframes that you originally expected, but also looking at when you're spending your money, when you expect to spend your money, particularly on capital side of things. We're asking both for the grant and the match funding that you've said you've got. We're looking at risks and issues for the project, and then for capital projects, we're looking at, in your application form, you have to state your current baseline of how your network is performing, and then your target of where you hope to get to once you've installed your measures. And so within your M&R returns, we're asking you to demonstrate whether those targets have been met. And that's why we do the M&R for 2 years after the project is commissioned, just to understand whether those targets are met, and also that they are then maintained across 2 heating seasons following the completion of the project. So we are monitoring how the funding is being spent, and that it is being spent correctly in line with what was applied for.
Great, thanks, Lou. So just to come back to our funded scheme, will you be looking to publish the customer survey or the findings from any of the surveys that you're undertaking?
Yes, we will. We can definitely share that. We can share that with GemServe to circulate. I'm interested in finding out, what customers think 6 months on.
Fantastic, thank you. And could you expand on some of the issues you had in terms of resident access? Were people not interested, did not understand the improvements that you were making, or did just not want to engage with the process?
So it was a complete mixture. There were some customers, and it's a general needs mixed building, so each customer was different. It was a mixture of mental health issues that were previously either not fully known by our Guinness support team, or uncovered sort of as the project went on. There was also issues with availability. Some of our customers work night shifts and just said, nope, you can't come in and do the work. Some of our other customers had issues around access into the home. So if there was hoarding, or even if they particularly had quite a lot of furniture, and it was hard for them to have to move furniture from one room to the other to allow us to do the install. So we had to be really adaptive and treat each customer differently. When we mapped it out of, we think we'll be able to do 8 appointments this week, we knew that we'd have to be really flexible with what we could achieve. And sometimes that meant having to go back into customers' homes and do work in bits and in sections, and other times it might be that the customer prefers to try and do as much as we can in a 2-day period and then never come back. So it was a complete mixture, and I think it was a really good lesson for my team in particular to not just assume that each customer's needs would be the same. We thought there'd be a level of having to go in and educate customers about the different system, the reasons for bigger radiators, the way that the controls would work, but it was just getting in to do the work and trying to explain to them sort of the impact on them, and what we could do to mitigate it. So we had things like I said, amongst the days that we had where we were on site, we also had a spare void flat. So if customers needed to go somewhere else whilst works were taking place because they would struggle with dust insulation or worked from home, there was a space that was available for them to use. Not all customers did use it, but it was there as an option.
Great. Yeah, sounds like some real challenges and
Yes.
and unforeseen challenges as well. Great. I think that those are all of the questions for you. Just see if there's any others. No. Louise, there was a. Oh, there we go. There's one come through. Thank you, Sam. What were the project governance structures that you used? So who were the key internal stakeholders or internal champions that that's already promoted the scheme?
So definitely our customer liaison team. I think most of the housing associations may still call them like housing officers, the housing team. They were instrumental. They obviously already had a good grounding of the customer base and certain key customers to be considerate of. But they were also really instrumental if it was then two people from Guinness from separate departments, both saying the same thing and both having that same united message that I think, especially in the early days of the project, of the what are we doing and why, was really helpful. Our customer support team were also amazing. When we did uncover sort of challenging situations for customers, they were aware of the reasons why we were on site and also helped us signpost customers in that moment, or within the space of a week, let's say, and really make some changes for them. I think also internally, aside from that, but when things did then go south and we needed more intervention, our tenancy enforcement team were also really helpful with helping us pass out what was available to us to use in the customer's tenancy agreement and what options we had for customers who, we were struggling to get access to and couldn't get, through the door or communicate with them. So I definitely advise, if you're applying for HNES funding, engage with those parties within your organisations. And start, explaining to them now what the challenges might be, and also how they could help. It's sort of additional to all of their daily tasks and their normal workflow programs as it was to ours originally. So it's just making sure that they're fully prepared as well, and that they know that you might be leaning on them more in the coming months.
Fantastic, thank you. Louise, just another question for you on HNES and the funding. Is it possible for an applicant to apply for funding for the same scheme twice? So, for example, if the interventions that were made didn't quite deliver the benefits that they were expecting?
It's an interesting one. I guess the first question we would be asking is why were they not met? And it would probably come down to a case-by-case basis in terms of understanding if it was because the interventions when they were installed weren't installed in quite the correct way or quite commissioned in the correct way, then initially we would want you to go back to the contractor and get those resolved. If it was because the initial feasibility work that was undertaken proved to not be as accurate as we might have hoped, then and there are other things that have since been discovered that could make more improvements, then potentially yes, that would be eligible. So I think it would come down to a case-by-case basis as to why the delivered measures weren't delivering what was expected, as to whether or not we would be able to accept a subsequent application. On a slightly wider point, it is possible to apply for the scheme for the same network. So, for example, if you apply for an optimization study, you would then be able to apply subsequently for capital funding to implement the measures that are recommended in the study. Or I guess actually to add on that, if initially you wanted to do one particular measure and then subsequently wanted to apply for a second or a different type of project, or if you wanted to do a particular one building on the network and then you wanted to do another building, something like that, you could submit separate applications for the same network. But yeah, it's only if you're trying to correct work that maybe didn't work properly initially, then that might be more of a challenge.
Thanks. Lou, another question similar to what you were just saying there. Is it possible to apply within the same round, but for 2 different HNES projects?
Yes, in terms if you mean 2 different networks, then yes, definitely. If you mean the same network with 2 projects, again, yes. It would be interesting to understand why you wanted to split out the 2 projects rather than submit one application for multiple interventions. But it wouldn't be rejected solely because you've submitted 2 applications for different projects of different interventions. So yeah, it would just be useful for us to understand the rationale for why that decision was taken. But if that was the decision that you wanted to take, then we would assess the applications on their individual merits.
Great, thank you. So we're almost out of time. Are there any further questions that anybody would like to ask any of our speakers? No. Okay, so it just leaves me to remind you to join our mailing list if you're not already on the mailing list. We also have a LinkedIn and a Twitter or X webpage that you can follow. And we've shared all the links to the relevant websites in the chat. We'll collate those in a follow-up email with the slides and a link to the recording. We're also asking for any feedback that you have on the session today. There's a link in the chat. It'd be great to hear how you thought today went. Thank you all so much for joining us, and hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.